Okay, we are now live on Facebook with the authors from A Bold Vision Forward, a framework for the strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization. And I will turn the presentation over to them.
Great, thanks, Bethany. Hi, everyone. Welcome. So glad you all are joining us today. So I'm just going to introduce myself, and then I'll turn it over to the authors to also introduce themselves. So I'm Stephen Quay. I currently serve as the past president of ACPA, and I work at Miami University as a faculty member. Melissa, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Beard-Jacob. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am one of the past Indigenous special advisors for the Columbus and Houston Convention. And professionally, I work at The Ohio State University as intercultural specialist for Native and Indigenous students.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Aho. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I serve as the Assembly Coordinator for Communities of Practice within ACPA, and professionally, I work at the University of Utah in housing and residential education.
Hi, my name is Dian Squire. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am an assistant professor in the Counseling Student Affairs program at Northern Arizona University.
Hello, I'm Andrea Domain, she, her, hers, and my pronouns. I'm currently the coordinator for commissions with the governing board, and for my professionally, I work at Davidson College as the assistant dean of students for diversity and inclusion.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Wang. I am a PhD student at the University of Iowa in the Higher Education Student Affairs program. My pronouns are they, them, and their.
Hi, I'm Flo Guido. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a professor emeriti at the University of Northern Colorado, and I'm a senior scholar with ACPA.
Great. And then the final author in the document is Dafina Lazarus D.L. Stewart. He is sick today, and so is not able to join us, but I just wanted to let you know that's another author on the document. So let me talk about how we're going to spend our time today. So we've come together with just an outline just to get us going. Our hope is that you've had time and space to read the document, to engage with us, to bring any questions, comments, feedback, reactions that you have. And then most importantly, we're just interested in knowing how is it resonating with you? How are you using it in your work? What's standing out, et cetera. And so we're going to start with just talking a little bit about how we approach the document. So what brought us together, the why of why we decided to put this document together. And then we're interested in just hearing what's resonating with people in the document. One or two of us will just share some pieces about what resonated with us as we wrote and read the document. And then we'd like to just open it up for anything from you all that needs clarification. What might be confusing? What are you struggling with? And then we'll talk about some ideas for dissemination, discussion, and application. In this section, we'll also share a little bit about how we are making sense of this document in our own work. And then we'll just close with any sort of final comments, reflections, and then the future opportunities that there will be to engage with the document. So that's how we're going to spend our time. I would also ask that if you have questions or reactions or things that you want us to discuss, feel free to use the comment feature on Facebook to just upload or type in any questions that you have, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can throughout our time here today. So our goal is not to talk at you for 60 minutes. So that means you all have to engage, and that's where you come in. And so we're very curious for your reactions. And so please ask questions because again, our goal is to not just talk at you for this entire hour. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Flo, who's going to talk a little bit about how we approach the construction of the document.
Thank you, Stephen. And thank you, Stephen, for setting up the process for how we constructed the document. I think all of us agree that the process was quite productive. And it was a way to allow everyone to have a voice in what this document looked like. I'm hoping that the majority of the people who are with us today have had an opportunity to read the section about how we constructed it, but just basically for just a second, I want to talk a little bit, and then I'm going to ask my colleagues to maybe talk just for a second about how they felt about the process of construction, because I know that for me it was phenomenally powerful. I know that when I was a new professional, which was almost 40 years ago, I was involved in a lot of small groups. I facilitated a lot of groups. I have never I have facilitated a writing group, several of them as a matter of fact. But this is the most inspirational, aspirational, the most exciting group, I believe, writing group that I've ever been with. And the creativity that came from this group was phenomenal, and my hats go off to everyone. I love you all a lot, and I enjoyed it a lot. I think that what we did in the beginning is that we listened to each other's stories. We spent a lot of the beginning of it listening to each other and listening to kind of why we had come and what we wanted from the group and what we hoped to gain in the couple of days that we were in Detroit when we put this together. And mostly we didn't talk. Mostly we listened, because I think to be successful in this kind of work, that's probably what we need to do. We need to listen to the humanness that each of us has and that each of us brings to the story, and hopefully in understanding our stories, we understand each other better. The first morning that we were together, Stephen asked us, and again, my hat goes off to you, Stephen, for creating a phenomenal process for us. And it truly was a group process. It wasn't like Stephen was the leader and we were following him. So it was truly, it was just a connection among people that truly cared about an issue, that wanted to make a difference, and were very thoughtful in speaking about what they wanted to get from it. I'm gonna open it up to my colleagues, and I think that we talked about in the morning, the first morning we were together, we talked about what our dreams were for racial justice and decolonization, and how we hope to make that happen, or how we wanted it to happen for us and for each other and for the profession. And from that, we spent time creating the model that is in the document, and thank you, Alex, for actually documenting kind of what we said and putting it together in a way that even made sense to us as we sat in Detroit and looked at it. And then from there, we filled in the pieces, and it was truly a collaborative project, and we truly wrote it together. And I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to see how they felt, if they were excited about the process as I was, maybe, or what they got from it.
I can go next and share a little bit about not only how we constructed the document, but really for myself, what personally resonates with me with this document. I think that first off, I'm extremely proud to have been a part of the creation of this. And again, thank you to Stephen for bringing us all together. I don't think I could have chosen a better group of people. And also, it was just really wonderful to get to spend time with all of you. You know, I'm from Michigan, and so I know Detroit very well. And so it was a really, really special experience. I think for myself, after reading the document, after it came to completion, you know, what really resonated with me and struck me as the beauty of it is all of the humanity and the heart that is in this document. I think that oftentimes student affairs and higher education professionals forget that a big part of our job is people, is heart. And so I think that through this process is a really great reminder of why I do the work that I do. Because our jobs are not easy. It's a lot of emotional strain, personal strain. But I think that the beauty of that, the good, the bad, the ugly is all wound up into this document beautifully. And also I loved, I think Flo had shared a little bit how it really came out of personal stories and sharing lived experiences. And especially as, an Indigenous researcher, narratives and storytelling is extremely important to culture, to heritage. And so it was really beautiful and lovely to get to hear everyone's stories and how those kind of manifested within the document. And also on a personal note, I'm really excited because my department is actually, we're at a moment of drafting some strategic planning. And so I'm super excited to have this document to really implement in some of the plans that we are facilitating as well. So I'll open it up if anyone else wants to share or reflect.
A couple other
Yeah.
kind
Oh,
of process
go ahead.
pieces, I'm sorry, is that prior to meeting up in Detroit, we all read Grace Lee Boggs' book, The Next American Revolution. And so that was sort of a guiding text, if you will, to just thinking about what does justice look like, what has history taught us, what does racial solidarity look like, what can activism look like, what is the role of love, things of that nature. And other people brought in other readings as well, like Angela Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle is something that a few of us drew from. I draw a lot from like Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and other folks had other readings by, Dean Spade and other folks. And so I think some of those readings are really important for our guidance in these sort of philosophical documents that aren't always brought into higher education and student affairs settings. And so wanting to think also sort of interdisciplinarily about doing this work, I think was really important as well. And so I just wanted to kind of put that out there as also a couple other resources that folks who are listening here and also reading along at home can also look for to kind of supplement this document and their own learning. And at the end of this document, obviously, there's a huge reference list for all of the resources that we drew from kind of formally. And so I also encourage people to check some of those out as well if they haven't. Alex?
No, I like and retweet everything Dian just said. I think that what I really love about this document is that it honors sort of the disciplinary barrier breakups we say we're trying to do in our field, and really goes beyond to several disciplines. I think too, what I really love and appreciate about this document, one is sort of the core foundation of love right at the middle, that like education and the doing and being of education is an act of love. But I also think that it's a document that is very conscious of itself. It's a document that looks backward at where we have been. It's a document that looks forward, but it's a document that also attends to a moment in time as well. So it's both very focused on the present, but also looks backward and looks forward, which I think is so critical, both in the work of racial justice and decolonization, but also in our work as a profession. ACPA in a 5 years will be celebrating its 100th anniversary, right? And what a moment in time to reconceptualize and rethink of our work that is both tethered to our disciplinary norms, but also looks at others as well and sees a sort of bold envisionment, or bold vision forward, as you will, moving forward. So I think, to echo the process too, is it was the blending of our stories, it was the blending of what we had read. The fact that we met in Detroit, I thought, was really critical, right? The very location where we met has a specific history that we wanted to make sure that this is where we constructed the document, not just anywhere, right? Yeah, so those are some of the things that are resonating with me, though I love absolutely the whole thing.
So I think something else that I would also add is, so for me, like Alex, I mean, all of it stands out. But the part that I really appreciate in the document is right at the beginning. So we constructed poems or little vignettes based on our conversation from the writing retreat, and we really thought that was important because we wanted to model that. Yes, we are the ones who came together to put together some ideas for this document, but we are all in process. We are all continuing, growing, learning, developing. And so it was important for us to model and practice the vulnerability that we think is expected of this work, and that we're wanting folks who are engaging it to do as well. And so you see snippets of conversations that we had as a group about things that we were struggling with in our own selves, and the ways in which we were perpetuating some of the very things that we were resisting. And so we thought that was an important inclusion because it illustrates that that we haven't claimed the territory on this knowledge. We're not experts in the sense of we're finished products. And so we wanted to model, again, the very practices that we're hoping you as readers also model in your work too. So for me, that's something that I wanted to also point out, because that to me is something that stands out. And you see just the ways in which we were digging deeply throughout our time at the retreat to frame some of what we were wanting as well. So I just wanted to list that additional piece as well. So I'm curious, I'm trying to look at the Facebook feed as well. If folks have questions around what's resonating with you or what's sticking out to you in the document so far, and we can maybe touch on some of those pieces. So I'm going to read one of the things that Claire Robbins posted. So Claire posted, one thing I appreciate about the document, because of the way the authors discuss their decisions around listing or not listing their social identities, I noticed that when reading the document, I was more conscious of how I was showing up as a reader with my own identities / positionality. Made me think about Sherry Watt's privilege identity exploration model, and think in a deeper way than I usually do about how the reading that I do is part of my practice. How I show up as a reader says a lot about how I might be showing up as an educator. I'm wondering if we could maybe expand on that a little bit about our choice in that process, because I know that's something that came up for us in the group. So can somebody maybe talk about our rationale or decision around that?
It's so long ago. Again,
I was
Dre.
looking at you, Dre.
I know you were, because I was. So I can speak for me. What I remember is it was a while ago. I think we've gotten to a practice collectively, not just in higher education, in many different types of research areas, where we kind of do the shopping list of here are all the identities before we even get to the actual heart of our work. And somehow that validates us being not necessarily an authority, but that before we even have our own voice, right, what have you. And so I think for me, I was personally resistant. I have no problem saying I'm a Black queer woman, middle class background, X, Y, and Z. But to me, I didn't want to lead with that in this document. I didn't want to be the Black woman or one of the Black people that was a part of the document, and just wanted to be able to communicate in a collective way kind of our perspective. I didn't want to get boxed in as this is what this person is saying, and wanted to think about it in a holistic. So I don't know if people have other additions. That was my landing point.
I can add quickly as well. As I was reflecting on our decision points there, in addition to what Dre shared, I think I leaned into Wanda Pillow's piece that we cite at the end as well, confession, catharsis, or cure, rethinking the uses of reflectivity as a methodological power in qualitative research, and thinking about how the way in which we approach reflexivity and thinking through our own identities really can say more than, as we were saying, that list of just starting that off and saying, check, like we took care of that, like we acknowledged our identities, and we're moving on. And so I think I remember us sitting with that, and I appreciate that we sat with that more so than just giving into what may be some of the norms around acknowledging identities right now within writing.
Maybe we're ready to move to the portion on what requires clarification. So I don't know, Dian, did you have something here you wanted to say, or is that just, do we want to just open it up for any questions or comments from folks around what they think requires clarification?
Yeah, I think this part is really for those who are watching to share any thoughts that they might have or questions. And so, yeah, we definitely want to keep seeing your comments in the Facebook Live feed here and see if there's anything that we can help you with as you're sort of working through the document. I think one thing that I do want to maybe, while people are sort of thinking, in the beginning, you know, we do spend a lot of time sort of setting up the document, which I think is really important and powerful. And in the front part, I reread it the other day on a plane ride, and I felt like a lot of like heat in my body, like feeling very like warm and excited and like moved by the piece, and like we spent time writing it, so I don't know if that's like narcissistic or something, but I think it was very like, it was like re-inspiring. It gave us, I think, a very positive way forward, right? This, you know, we say a bold vision forward, but you know, it gave us something to look forward to work toward. And I think for me, it showed a lot of, yeah, once again, this like reflexivity, this really important recognition of like where we are as a society, as a field, and as individual people. And then we sort of get into the kind of nuances of this framework that Alex kind of drew for us, and that has been articulated within the document. The one kind of piece in there that, you know, we say is there aren't necessarily specific actions that one takes to move forward in this way. That a lot of this is kind of about our worldviews and our mindsets, and how we sort of think about how we interact with people and how we think about how we do the work of racial justice and decolonization in student affairs. And I think that's a really important, like, continued clarification to make, that there's not always a right way, and that we should fumble through some of the messiness of this work, and that we will fumble through the messiness of this work. And so when people, or if people are seeking that step 1, 2, 3 best practices, they're most likely not going to find that in this document. And I think that that's part of the power of it, because context matters, right? Like where we situate ourselves in society, you know, geographically and otherwise is important to how we do the work. So hopefully for those people who are watching, you will also be able to articulate that to the folks that you interact with as you share the document and teach it in your classrooms, as some of you said you are, or in your strategic planning meetings, like Melissa was talking about, and that I've heard other people talk about as well, that you can kind of share vision for the document itself as well. I think that that's really important to remember. So I would say that. As somebody for myself who is sometimes very practical as well, I do sometimes seek that kind of like, how do you do some of this? And that's actually part of like what I'm working on currently as a faculty member, is particularly this part around like the love part, which is what we say is sort of the core of this entire process. And I sort of come at it with the question for myself of like, how do we love somebody who, one, maybe we don't know, or two, that we really dislike, or three, has harmed us in some way. And so I think those are sort of the pieces that I continue to grapple with as somebody who is engaged in this process, as somebody who's read a lot of these other texts that really do center love as well, like Grace Lee Boggs, like Paulo Freire, and Bell Hooks, right? Like these folks all center love at the in the middle of their praxis. And for me, I'm trying to figure out like, how do you actually love? Like, how do you engage in the process of love? Not just say that like love is important and it can do X, Y, Z, and it can build community and bring communities together. That it's greater than just kind of one-on-one amorous love. And so I think those are sort of the pieces that I continue to want to clarify for myself and read up on. And so in kind of that vein, I'm interested in also what our viewers today and listeners today are thinking about as some of the component pieces that maybe are tripping them up a little bit, or they aren't quite sure maybe how to apply this framework to their own work. And I don't know if any of the other authors have any comments based off of what I just said either.
Yeah, and if I could, I just, one of the things that I was remembering too about when we wrote the document or when we finished it was, I think we went back and we had the framework for the strategic imperative, as if there was only one, as if this was the end. And I really like and remember what Alex just said about their oh, I'm sorry. That it's a process that is in a moment in time. So we wrote this document because we were at a process in a moment in time. And I think that there might be other things that could be added as people begin to work with it, as people begin to use it, as people begin to hopefully look at it as a way of being, that they have other insights that they could share with us, or with, in a way that allows this document, I think Stephen said it in the beginning, as more of a living document. And I think for me, sometimes we don't see this as, and I hope my colleagues jump in, but I don't think we see this as, this is the answer, and this is the only answer, that there are many answers, and there are many answers beyond this document, or at least more questions.
I agree with that, Flo. I actually just wrote this down, and I'm looking at a question I saw on Facebook, and so I'll talk about this later on in our conversation, but this was actually the document was brought into my campus 2 weeks ago. I was like, oh, I was nervous. And they asked me a question that I think, I don't know if people have asked the other authors this question, like, what was your hope for this document? Like, what did you want to see come from this? I was like, oh, I didn't think about that. And I mean, honestly, but I think now I have a better answer. I did answer at the time. And I want this to be a document of grapple. I mean, to be real talk, I know that we're academics. Sometimes we're academics, not all of us are. But I want someone to tell me you're wrong, or I don't agree with this, or come up with something else. I very much agree with you, Flo. I don't want this to be centered as the documents on racial justice and decolonization. I'm hoping this is the beginning of an entry point for many people to be in the conversation. And so for me, it was exciting to see that happen a little bit on my campus, but I want to see other documents. I want to see sessions at convention. I want to have more conversations, because obviously I know we've not hit everything. And there's
Mm-hmm.
and also my understanding of race and my analysis of race is that it's ever changing, and so is colonization. It's always evolving. That we have to
Yes.
adapt and be dynamic in that moment as well. So I completely agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have a couple questions that have come in. So I'll read Ray's first, and then if anybody wants to answer that. Ray asks, how does ACPA hold itself accountable to the ideals of this framework that are provided within the document? So what are maybe some of your thoughts around how do we hold ourselves as an association accountable to what we've written in this document?
I can think of one. So I'll speak for you a little bit, Stephen. So I mean, I think we're just beginning, right? If we really think about the imperative itself in broad strokes, it's what, 3 years old, maybe at best. I do think, as you know, thinking from a governing board perspective in particular, the most direct way I could think of that we've thought about that is through our elections and noms committee, and how we're trying to be more mindful of that. I'm seeing a lot of conversation, and shout out to the commissions because I work with y'all. They're doing really great work of really trying to figure out how do we infuse the imperative into the functional areas of different folks' jobs. And so, you know, is there a clear plan in place? Not specifically, but I'm seeing us beginning to grapple and beginning to infuse it and have the mindfulness in it. And I'm hoping with the next one or two governing boards coming in that they will have more grounded plans of how they'll incorporate that. But I think we're at some entry points right now.
Yeah, I think playing off Dre a little bit. I was in that governing board retreat. I think Stephen, I believe you were there as well, right? Like where we drafted kind of the initial intention of the strategic imperative. Like I literally wrote I wrote notes on a napkin essentially within a conference space that then became sort of a guiding piece of what is now the strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization. At that point, we didn't know what we were doing, but we knew that something had to happen, that there was so much happening within society that was so negative. And, you know, I mean, there's always been this racial injustice, and, you know, decolonization has happened for the entire history of what we now call the USA. And, but with, you know, media and all that stuff, it's been much more brought to the fore. And so I think as a governing board, and we sort of felt a pressure to make sure that we were doing all we could as an association to support the work that was happening on college campuses. But we didn't have that much at that point beyond that. And so then what came out of that were listening sessions at convention, letters from particular groups, particularly Native Indigenous groups, where we then thought about, well, what does it mean to include decolonization? And Stephen wrote a letter about that and all that. And then from there on out, you know, we had more listening sessions. We had, you know, the governing board continued to do their work. We had caucuses at ACPA last year that are continuing again this year. And so I think these are all sort of the component parts where we're starting to figure out how do we hold ourselves accountable to this work. And I think part of that also is personally holding ourselves accountable as individuals, you know, for ourselves personally, but also to the people who are within our networks. So any of those folks in our commissions or coalitions and on our campuses, in our offices, our faculty, you know, peers, I think those are all ways that we hold ourselves accountable to the document. That is also linked to how ACPA can continue to hold itself accountable as well, as those people are infused within an organization. Organizations don't exist on their own, right? Like they're run by people, and we are 8 of the people who are part of the organization, and so is the 45 people who are watching this, and it's all of our jobs to hold ACPA accountable, and ACPA is us, or along with the convention theme, like we are ACPA, right? I think that that's all part of what we need to be doing to, you know, to kind of answer Ray's question there. I don't know if other people have any other thoughts. There's also another question we can move to.
The part that you said, Dean, and I won't belabor it because I think you said it quite well. I just wanted to add a little bit was the holding ourselves accountable. I think for me, I think if we spend a lot more of our energy and time worrying about ourselves and how we're showing up, how we're not showing up, as opposed to trying to call people out for other things, to me, that's one way in which to do this, is to hold ourselves accountable and invest time into thinking about where are the places I need to do my own work, where are the places I need to grow. And that's not me saying we shouldn't hold other people accountable. I just think it's a lot easier to hold other people accountable for stuff than it is to hold ourselves accountable. And so for me, if we spend more time on ourselves in that regard, that I think it translates into the entire association because we're invested in thinking about our own limitations and areas of growth. So that's the only piece that I would echo in what Dian just said.
Great, thanks. We can go to Jody's question. Jody asks, can you all please talk about the tension of holding that openness to love within differential power structures, institutional or interpersonal?
I think first, hello to my advisor. Second, I think that the framework of love that is in the document, I think, I am very informed by bell hooks and Ruby Sales on this one. But this idea that I think love is often sort of thought of this very happy, positive emotion. But both bell hooks and Ruby Sales talk about love as not being the opposite of anger. And that anger can be subsumed under love. And so the reason we are often angry, or as bell hooks would talk about, engage in critique of others, is because we care about them enough to want them to be better. And I think so interpersonally, right, even in situations where power, there are different levels of power, different means of power. There is a way to ground critique in love versus grounding critique in destruction or dehumanization. And I think this document is really speaking to a humanizing process that's both interpersonal, institutional, and structural. It's trying to speak to all of those levels at once. And so I think there is a way interpersonally to do that. I think institutionally, right, it's hard, right? I think that there are times where we center things like empathy or compassion, which are both really important, but there also has to be structural change that happens at the same time of those things. And how do we, like Dian was saying earlier, how do we wrestle with these sort of how to love questions of, and I think Dian was mentioning people, but how do we create processes and something different, right, that centers love in the middle. Others can feel free to chime in.
Yeah, Jody, I think this is the question that I'm sort of grappling with now, just sort of on like a scholarly front. So as I mentioned, I've been just reading a lot about love and particularly like humanization and how kind of love fits into that framework. And so I also have been reading some bell hooks, and she particularly writes that when we love somebody, we see the world the way it is. And I also think back to like when we think about humanization, or when we see somebody as human, generally we say like, I see you or I know you. I think that's often kind of like a phrase that we hear quite often. And so I think ultimately, if we kind of combine these two things together, then what bell hooks is saying potentially is that I see you existing in the world in the way that it is. That is ultimately that I understand the ways that systemic oppression, racism, sexism, ableism, genderism, trans antagonism, classism, whatever it is, impact your life. And as a result of that, I will then act in a different way and do differently in order to then like see you as human. And most people argue also, Eric Fromm, who writes about love a lot, also says that love is an action, right? Like we don't just have love, but we have to live love, and love will lead to justice. And so I think then adding on to that, going back to Bell Hooks again, she then writes that like there's no better place to learn the art of love than in community. And so I think part of what we need to do is to recognize communities that currently exist and kind of the love that's built within those, and then continue to build stronger communities on our college campuses to continue to battle isolation within the spaces, because that does breed depression and oppression. And so figuring out, I think those are kind of like the two levels, if you will, of like how do we start to do this work also, is like how do institutions reject the commodification of bodies and neoliberals like pull and push to put people in competition and separate people. So like how do we battle that and then continue to build these communities that are interconnected and intergenerational and intersectional and all the other enters you can think of, and build those communities that then produce love by the actions that take place within them. And I think those are the ways that we begin to humanize. And I'm sure there are some great models out there for how that happens. So I think also kind of identifying those models and figuring out how to kind of do them contextually appropriately in different spaces will be important. And Rachel, Stephen, and I were having kind of a little Facebook convo about this last night as well. So I don't know if either of them want to add on to that.
The piece that I would add on, Dian, I'm thinking a lot about, so one of the things that came up when we met was, and this was actually in the beginning of the document in Melissa's section, about the notion of apologizing and how we keep apologizing for mistakes that we make. And it made me think a lot about the resolution for name that we did at convention, about the past trauma and harm that we have caused as an association. So there's multiple pieces going on in my head right now, so give me a moment. So then the other piece to add on to that is, this morning I saw something that Lori Patton Davis tweeted around apologizing. I don't have it pulled up, so I'm just going to try to paraphrase it. So my apologies if I butcher this a little bit, but what stood out to me was Lori tweeted something around, I'm sorry for what I did. So it's acknowledging that you have caused harm. So apologizing, acknowledging what the harm was. And then also acknowledging that the person doesn't have to accept your harm or accept your apology, or may not be in a position to do so, and that's okay. But then to me, the most important part that stood out to me was, here's what I'm going to do differently moving forward. And so to me, I think that's the part to me that's rooted in love and compassion, is the action piece. And so rather than just simply for us as an association saying, hey, Native, Aboriginal, and Indigenous Network, we have caused past harm. Yes, we've acknowledged that, but to me, the more crucial piece is, what are we going to do moving forward? And so how are our actions going to look different moving forward so that we don't continue to repeat that harm? Because then that's when I think apologies become empty, is when there's no action that's attached to it. And so this connects again back to this notion of accountability. If we're accountable for ourselves, we're paying attention to the harm that we've caused, we're acknowledging it, but then we're taking steps to repair that and doing something differently moving forward. And so to me, I think that's what folks can take away from this document as well, is to be thinking about, we're imperfect, we're flawed people who are going to make mistakes, but it doesn't let us off the hook. Like, to me, mistakes cause pain and harm, and our job is, in the midst of those mistakes, is to acknowledge the harm and then to act differently next time so we don't continue to perpetuate that harm moving forward. So that to me is like the piece that I wanted to highlight as well. That to me is really crucial.
That might be a nice segue into Dre and Rachel
Dian,
maybe talking about. Oh, yeah,
if I may, just for a second, I'm also struck too, and I think we write about it in the document when we were talking about the question that Jody asked, that Alex was answering about what do we do in terms of applying this in our institutions? And I think that for many people, they think of this as something that's very abstract that maybe they can't do. And I'm phenomenally struck by the notion that institutions of higher education pride themselves on making their decisions on efficiency. And I think that what we're talking about, and I don't necessarily want it to be a dichotomy, but I think what we're talking about is very different than efficiency, because if you're only being efficient, you probably aren't tending to the needs of the people in the organization. And I think if we think about that as we make policy, as we do things in our institution that are going to affect the people that I mean, we want to help all students, right? And not just a certain group of students. And to me, that's really important too. I think we can look at that as an institution and figure out ways in which we can stop doing that, even though I understand that money is important and that we need to be efficient in some of the services that we're offering, the things that we're going to do. But if we're going to treat students as whole students and as individuals, which I think is what we want to do, then I think that we need to look at this a little bit. We need to look at that efficiency in different ways.
thanks, Bob. Rachel and Dre, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about some ideas for dissemination and discussion?
Sure. So again, Dre, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I'll be a little selfish, use my campus. So it happened to be, we have professional development learning communities at my campus, and my dean, not me, I was proud of that, suggested that one of our groups read the imperative before it came out, and we actually paired it together with Robert Nash's piece on social justice advocacy and different types of communication. What I loved about that experience, a couple of things came out of that is, one, it was a mixed group of student affairs folks. So from outdoor ed to me to student activities to civic engagement, it was a really mixed group. And my colleagues mentioned a few things of what they're doing with the document, just beyond reading it in their own personal. One, they were talking a lot about where they thought they were, what they needed to do work and improvement, and identifying either various parts of our framework to work on. Tangible things that I've seen my colleagues are doing so far is, one, the document is going to be used with some of our student staff training this summer, and using that as a way of having a conversation about how we engage with this work with our leadership of students. Residence Life is using it in two different ways. So one of my colleagues is really thinking about how to infuse some of the aspects of the imperative into our residential curriculum across the board, and another colleague also in Res Life is using this as a measurement and thinking about supervision. And so that was the one that stood out the most to me. And he observed that, oftentimes our students of color and our Native American Indigenous students are the ones that are charged with holding space and creating extensions of what typically would be maybe in a cultural center and things like that. Meanwhile, folks of dominant identities don't have that same expectation and are not even considered evaluated on that aspect. And so he's really going to be using this as a talking point with his staff to really engage about how are all of us showing up for all of our students and engaging with this work in the residence halls. And then like we mentioned earlier as well, I've heard just on Facebook chatter, a lot of various faculty across the country are using this curricularly for graduate student prep programs and things like that. So Rachel, did you have additions of ideas or what you've heard so far?
Yeah, I'm actually glad to hear that you mentioned using this with undergraduate students as well, because I think a lot of what I've seen thus far is folks mentioning how they plan to use this within graduate preparation programs, which I think is fantastic, and this should be used there, but I think it can also extend to our undergraduate population. So I'm actually doing a guest lecture later on this month with our undergraduate leadership capstone course that we have here on campus. They read John Dugan's book about leadership theory, and so we're using this as a supplemental piece for their class to start thinking a little bit more deeply around racial justice and decolonization within the context of their own thinking about their leadership going forward as they graduate after this. So I'm really excited to see how that goes, but I think this can certainly be utilized to spur some of those conversations, both at the graduate and undergraduate levels. And then within my own department in our division, I think we're finding that this piece helps give some ideas and spurs some thought among our team as to how to respond to some of the charges that our division is making for us. So recently we were asked by our vice president to take a look at our policies and practices within each of our departments through a racial justice lens. For a lot of our staff members, we were kind of sitting in the same place that some of our ACPA members were when we launched the imperative of saying, like, what does that mean? Like, how do I want to do that, and I want to have this conversation, but how? Where should I start? And so while this document, as we've mentioned, doesn't provide a step-by-step, we hope that it spurs ideas towards practice and towards action in a lot of ways, and that's some of the response that I've heard thus far is that it provided some grounding to help folks reflect more deeply on either their own actions or actions they can take through a policy and practice lens as well. And so I hope that folks find this document to do the same on their campuses as well. So those were a few of the things that I've seen and heard thus far about how the document is being used.
That's fast.
I think the only thing I will add, I'm also watching Facebook at the same time. Yeah, I agree with Flo. It is fast. You know, there's some people that are ready to jump in, and that's great. And we know that there will likely be a staggering. So my invitation to everyone is please let us know. I don't have a vehicle. Besides, I don't know who to email. But I would love personally to know how people are using it. I'm super curious. Whether it's I just read it on my own to I'm trying it with this program to whatever, thinking about, as Melissa mentioned, strategic planning. Like I would love for all of us to know and be in conversation about that. I've been following Facebook a little bit, and people are like, yeah, this is inspiring some ideas for me to think about that I haven't thought about. So as it's emerging and there's more time, I would love to be able to continually find a way of collecting all that information and having that available. So.
So we have just a few more minutes left. I wondered if there's any final question or two from folks who have been watching today.
Well, one question I just want to, KJ Watts asked, where do you actually find the document? So I think that that's a good question to answer. So you can actually go to the member portal at myacpa.org. And if you are a member of ACPA, you can download it. And then Angela added there, thank you, that you can actually just go to the resources tab under the My Portal, and it's the first link that's posted under there. So thank you, Angela, for expanding on that. So just so you can retrieve it and start reading it.
We might also, I don't have the information in front of me, but we might also remind people of at the conference when we're going to have our 2 sessions, if they'd like to come and be part of a face-to-face conversation on the topic. Anybody have that? Maybe, Stephen, do you have that information?
Yep. So for those of you who are going to join us in Boston for ACPA, and we hope that you will be. So there'll be 2 additional opportunities for you to engage with us as authors. One is on March 4th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and then the other is on Tuesday, March 5th at 8:30 a.m. So again, that's Monday, March 4th at 1:30, and then March 5th at 8:30 a.m. The other piece that I would add as we close up our time this afternoon slash morning is I think it's a risk, I think, to put ideas out there. So I just wanted to just vocalize that and just extend my profuse gratitude to the authors of this document for embarking on this journey to put together some ideas for people to react and respond to. And so I know for those of you who are also engaged in this work, it's a risk, I think, to put ideas out there, to suggest something to your colleagues for them to do. And so I think sometimes we don't recognize the difficulty of putting ideas out there that can be critiqued. And so I just wanted to say that to the authors that I really see you and I appreciate the vulnerability that you all shared in putting ideas out there for folks to respond to. Much like Dre, though, having said that, I'm super excited. I want you to tell us what you think about it. We don't want this to be just a document that sits on the shelf and collects dust. Like, we really want to engage with you around this. It's not a finished document, and so any ideas that you offer will be helpful as we continue to tweak and work on these ideas and make revisions. And so please tell us what's resonating with you, what's missing, what are some additional resources or readings that we could add to it to extend our knowledge and the knowledge of readers. And so for us, please do share feedback with us, because that's the only way, I think, to understand how it's resonating with folks and how you're making sense of it. And then my last ask is that you actually use it. And so I appreciate the ideas that Rachel and Dre shared about how folks on their campuses are using it. I would love for you all to tweet or to post or to share ideas with ACPA about, this is something that I did and this is what worked. And so, because I think the more we collect those resources, it helps other folks see that there are ways that they may not have thought about to use this document as well. So for me, I think I'm just really curious to see how folks are making sense of it, and then just how you're using it in your work as educators. Any other final comments from the authors?
No, but thank you all for joining us and sticking around with us and having a discussion. Sorry, I was typing. I was responding to a comment. So if you heard that typing, I was responding to Lexi. Lexi had asked about how to incorporate the document into their graduate assistantship. So I was just sort of maybe giving some suggestions there if people want to continue that discussion online.
All right. Well, that's it then. Thank you all so much. I also just want to acknowledge the ACPA Foundation for their generous financial support in helping us put together the retreat and for our travel. And so I just want to acknowledge them for believing in the imperative and putting some money behind it. I think that's also really important too. And so we look forward to your reactions, engagement, and if you're in Boston, we'll see you on either the 4th or the 5th. Having said that, I just appreciate your time. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a good rest of your day and week.